Okay, so cybersecurity, I guess people, I won't say they're bored of it, but I mean, it's an everyday thing, you know, it's front and center all the time. But what are the particular challenges, you know, at the present time? And I'm thinking perhaps that the COVID-19 and the pandemic was a bit of a watershed moment in cybersecurity, but just your thoughts as to where the major challenges lie at the moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? You say it's never kind of far away from the headlines. And back in the day, it used to be a little bit like, it made the BBC. It made, primetime news headlines, and that was almost a measure or a thing of note. But today it is like you say, it's almost people are bored of it. Every single day there are headlines relating to cybersecurity and one organization or another. So the threat landscape certainly has worsened. And I think probably particularly since the pandemic, obviously during the course of the pandemic, organizations suddenly had to relocate all of their employees more or less into remote working that weren't doing that before. And I think the interesting thing now in the post-pandemic era, we haven't all moved back to the office, but we haven't all stayed at home all the time either. So it's like the threat landscape has almost been stretched a bit. So we've now got the challenge of users working from home and perhaps the lack of control, certainly the perceived lack of control. And also, it's perhaps a bit more relaxed environment. We were just talking just now about other distractions and other things going on, and it makes both the user, the devices and the data more vulnerable than perhaps it was in the confines of a kind of pure play office environment that we had before the pandemic. And, I think beyond that, kind of side by side with the pandemic, we've really seen this acceleration in migration to the cloud. And that brings a lot of challenges of its own, both in terms of many breaches that we see in the cloud are as a result of misconfiguration. Many breaches are as a result of identity management, or perhaps better said, mismanagement in those environments. It's new, it's managed in a different way to on-premise kind of environment. So I think a lot of the challenge, certainly from an organizational point of view, is really around the breadth of digital transformation we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And I guess side by side with that, all those things that we've been seeing over the course of the last 10 or 20 years repeatedly, ransomware, phishing, supply chain attacks, none of those things are really new, but they seem to keep coming around the block, and we experience them over and over again.
Yeah, and you've just fairly recently produced a report, I think, in association with the Ponemon Institute. The title, I'll read it out. So, security in the C-suite, making security priorities, business priorities. So you had a look at what was going on with the covers, and I believe you sort of discovered that the responsibility for cybersecurity, you've got obviously your chief information security officers, and then you've got other board members, most obviously the CEO. Just what did you discover about who thought they were responsible, and what the reality was, as opposed to what perhaps should be happening? Yeah, just what you discovered.
Yeah, no, it was actually a really interesting survey to dig into those things a bit. And we actually found that less than 10% of CISOs or whatever title the security leader in the organization had a direct reporting line to the CEO. And whilst in one way you can get a bit too carried away with that as a focus, I think it does illuminate a little bit. Cybersecurity can still be seen as a very technical discipline, and the report kind of went on a bit further and asked about how does the board perceive security leaders, and typically the C-suite and the board tended to perceive security leaders as being able to support the business objectives, but they were much less certain about whether the security leader understood the business objective. And that's where, you know, I think there's perhaps a little bit of a disconnect here. And that ability to get in front of the C-suite directly, to get in front of the CEO, to get in front of the board, and kind of gain that ability to communicate the risks within cybersecurity. You know, there's no getting away from it. It's a very technical discipline, but the ability to translate that into business language, into risk that the C-suite and the board are used to discussing, I think that's a really big thing for CISOs and other security leaders to consider. And, you know, I think for that reason, we're seeing a bit of an uptick in CISOs going after things like an MBA to kind of add in that business aspect to, you know, many CISOs may well have come from a very highly technical background. But if you can't translate that into something that the broader business can kind of understand, then, you know, whether I report directly to the CEO or not becomes a bit immaterial if I can't communicate in a way that resonates with what the rest of the business are trying to achieve. So I think, you know, digging into this a little bit and being able to pivot into more of a thinking about security in a business sense is really key right in the time we're in now.
And did the report, or just anecdotally, do you think they, I don't know what you call it, miscommunication or lack of communication between security and the board, do you think that's directly sort of security incidents are directly attributable to that gap in understanding? So that the security people, maybe, you know, somebody's made a business decision and the security person has done what they think is required, but they haven't warned them. You do actually realize if we go ahead and do this, there's a possible vulnerability. I mean, I'm not saying they're sitting there being really sulky, but do you just think generally that that lack of communication, you know, mutual understanding could be the cause of data breaches issues?
I think certainly if there's a kind of gap in understanding there and a gap in communication, it can lead to, you know, I think it's kind of the famous office of no, right? If the business perceives the cybersecurity function as a whole as a blocker, they're going to slow us down. We're trying to be fast and agile here, and all we get is no, you can't, no, you can't. In a way, the business is likely either to avoid it, or maybe you're just completely talking past each other, and then I think that can certainly lead to security incidents in and of itself, and being able to have that meaningful conversation. Yes, we can do this, but the risks associated with it are X, Y, and Z. Is that within the risk appetite of the C-suite, the board, the organization more generally, or not? And you know, being able to come to the table as someone with a solution rather than just someone who's basically trying to stop everything. We can't eliminate all risk, right? If we're going to operate businesses, inherently there's risk associated with that, and it's being able to manage that to a level that's acceptable for the business that I think is really key here.
And so that it sounds like that. I mean, the first important thing is to get those lines of reporting established so that everyone understands, you know, what their role is or isn't. But to your point you made there just there as well, there's an inherent risk in being in business, and therefore does cybersecurity need to pivot away? I know I've sat through endless presentations where the idea is that you can actually stop all the attacks, you know, you can actually, you know, defend. And I think we have now got to the, you know, era where we recognize that everyone's going to have something happen to them. So it's more about cyber resilience, you know, how you respond to issues. Is that sort of where we should be at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, the industry a few years ago kind of generally adopted this. It's when, not if. We accept that, but it doesn't seem to have stopped everybody throwing their hands up in horror when anybody is breached. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And, you know, a determined attacker, they're a human being. We're not talking about a piece of software you're trying to defend against. You're talking about creating defenses against a resourceful, potentially determined human being who wants to achieve a goal. So, you know, of course, preventative technologies remain important to kind of catch the low-hanging fruit of attacks, and the things that can keep us generally safe. But when an attacker actually penetrates your defenses and gets in, whether that's through a phishing attack or whether it's through social engineering or some other means, then, as like you say, the resiliency of the broader cybersecurity strategy is really what's at stake. And to that point, you know, yes, I have prevention technologies in place, but beyond that, the ability to detect things that are unusual in my environment, things that I don't normally see. You've got things like, for example, multi-factor authentication. Many organizations implement that, but for example, to look out for things like MFA spamming. So they're trying to MFA over and over and over again, and in the end, somebody's fed up with the push notifications, so they just press yes, either knowingly or by accident. You know, I must have resiliency for those kind of controls where I can say, well, okay, yeah, they pressed yes by mistake, but I've actually got the controls in place that say, hey, I've seen that, and I can follow up and do something with it.
And does it surprise? I mean, my background's sort of storage industry, so backup and recovery is, you know, a very old topic. But I'm still slightly surprised that it would appear that, yeah, hopefully a minority of organisations, but a lot of them, you know, with a ransomware attack, you know, they appear to be paralysed by it, or you know, they have to end up paying the ransom rather than having you know, a relatively simple backup and recovery procedure in place, which will, you know, circumnavigate. Are you perhaps, as I say, I know there's obviously a cost attached to these things, and maybe companies have assessed the risk and gone, okay, we're not paying that extra for that, so you know, if it happens, it happens. But are you perhaps a little bit surprised that, where say whether it's on minority or hopefully a minority of companies, still don't do some fairly basic stuff that could mitigate, you know, some of the standard, you know, cybersecurity problems?
Yeah, I am really, and I think one of the interesting things, I've been quite a fan of the Centre for Internet Security Critical Security Controls, what used to be known as the SANS Top 20. And if you look at those, and certainly implementation group 1, which is kind of the basic entry level of it, it really is a lot around these very basic cybersecurity hygiene type approaches. And I actually read a report recently that said, if you implemented the CIS controls at the very basic level, some reports had shown that would thwart up to 85% of attacks, which is a phenomenal statistic, because many of those things are around things like knowing what assets you've got, knowing who your users are, and as you've touched on here, implementing a backup strategy. And I think as an industry, we perhaps, there's a little bit of a tendency to chase the new shiny object, you know, this kind of silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. But if organizations could just take a little bit more time to focus on some of those basic things, you know, you mentioned backup, which is obviously critically important, other cyber hygiene type things, regular patching, you know, implementing multi-factor authentication, you know, some of those very basic things that we know about can really make an enormous difference. And as you say, every CISO on the planet is concerned about ransomware, right? Well, let's take the simple steps that at least give me a fallback should the worst happen in my organization.
And in terms of, I mean, you've alluded to some of the things that that can be done. But is there a standard? I know there are various industry models, but there's also, I think, at last count, over 100 different categories, subcategories of cybersecurity. So it's obviously a very complicated sort of area. But is there a sort of recommended step-by-step approach to getting yourself towards a sort of cyber resilient organization, or is it just too much depends on the specifics of what business you're in and what you need?
No, I think it is very important to understand your business. I don't think you can just take a kind of generic template and say, do this and you'll be secure kind of thing. You need to understand what is your business about, what's important to your business, and I think that's something that CISOs can well focus on. Kind of, if we're going to talk about the first 100 days kind of approach, what's important to your organization? How does the organization tick? So that in a way you can align more with ways of working and so on. But I think in terms of overall resiliency, my advice would be pick a framework. Like you say, there's many frameworks out there. Some are specifically aligned to particular industries, others are of a more generic nature. But what you do find is there's enormous overlap across all of those types of frameworks, because ultimately the outcome that they're trying to get to is very similar. So if you look at something like ISO 27001 and NIST, the level of overlap in those two is of course enormous, and many of the other compliance frameworks and security frameworks around the world really use one of those two as their fundamental basis. I quite like the CIS controls because I think they're quite simple. It's a very good starting place, and they're also mapped to many of the other control frameworks. But I think it really is, start with knowing your business. How does your business want to work? What kind of organization are you? Is it a kind of fast and agile, and I want to be able to release software every week or 2 weeks or every month, or is it a more slow moving organization that's perhaps got very strict industry type regulations and are in a closely regulated space? But I certainly think it is possible to get to that kind of optimized resilient state for every organization. And of course, if the figures are right about this 85%, if you do the basics, you're that much more secure than anyone around you. At least you won't be one of those who kind of falls as the low-hanging fruit.
And in terms of it, if you do that and choose a framework or a combination of frameworks to develop your strategy, I mean, does that automatically give you a good understanding of the types of solutions you will then need to implement? Because as I said earlier, there are a vast amount of those out there. Or is there again a standard set? If you've got a firewall and this and that, then that's the basic, and then you can add some. Well, yeah. How does someone negotiate? Because we've got zero trust, extended detection and response. Some of the latest buzzwords, threat detection, etc. If you're a CISO or a board level person, I can imagine you might just hold your head in hands and say, well, where do I start?
No, absolutely, and I think this is really a key point. If you think about modern cybersecurity approaches, you touched on zero trust, which has gained a lot of popularity in the last few years. You can't deliver that via technology alone. And in fact, if you start with technology or tools first, then you'll very likely end up with a little bit of a Frankenstein approach, or even I've suddenly discovered I've actually got 3 or 4 products that are overlapping in the same area, and I'm paying for 3 products when I could only be paying for 1. So I think it is really important to start off with this question what is it that I'm trying to protect? You know, I'm not trying to stop the company lunch menu from being published on the open internet. I don't really care about that, but I do really care about the personally identifiable information that is entered into my public facing website, or the intellectual property of the organization. And I think starting there, what is it that I'm trying to protect? Who should have access to it, and under what circumstances? That gives me a really good basis to start to think about what kind of tooling do I need in order to achieve that. And I think the thing, I'm certainly a believer in zero trust myself, and I think the thing that model and approach gives us is that way of thinking. It's kind of about the data and the people first, and then the tooling serves that purpose, because otherwise, you know, there's new security tooling and new acronyms in this space released every week of the month pretty well, and it is a confusing space. But I think we need to have our eye much more firmly fixed on the outcomes, and that will help us to invest in the right kinds of tooling.
And just, I mean, we touched earlier on the sort of the CISO, CEO, board level sort of interactions, but also I'm thinking, because I think I'm still right, that if not the majority, a significant minority of security incidents are related to, you know, whether it's malicious internal or quite often just, you know, bungling internal, you know, people opening the, as you say, phishing and all that kind of stuff. But so do you think, again, people need to be educated? You know, it's not just that board level, but everyone just needs to be constantly, you know, reminded that if someone's, you know, offering you £1 million, if you give them their bank account details or the company, it probably ain't, you know, a sensible thing to do. That just needs to be reinforced. Again, you're perhaps surprised that individuals within companies don't really understand their cybersecurity responsibilities. They just think, oh, the cybersecurity, you know, security department's got me sorted, so, you know, I can more or less do what I want.
Yeah, and this is where I think cybersecurity really needs to be a top-down approach in organizations. It's no good trying to kind of push it up to the C-suite. You know, if you can get the CEO on board and the C-suite on board, and perhaps, you know, at a company town hall or something of that nature, speak about the importance of cybersecurity. And ultimately, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility in an organization. The CISO and their office obviously have the technical expertise and the overview of it, but I, as an individual contributor in an organization, it's really important those people get training, they understand what the risks are, and, you know, not least that there's a kind of open culture of reporting. And I think that there probably has been a little bit of a tendency to kind of blame the user. You know, the stupid user clicked on a link again. But actually, if you look at some of the more recent types of phishing attacks, they are very, very believable. And even seasoned security pros now and then might do a double take and, oh, I nearly got caught out by that one, if they weren't actually caught out. And, you know, back to the fact it's a human being on the other end, you know, a really well-crafted email to somebody who's, you know, perhaps working from home, perhaps got a few distractions going on, and you just catch them just at the right time, that can still be successful. So I think the education and awareness is a very, very important element, but also the kind of culture where I can report a security incident and put my hand up. Hey, I clicked on this link by accident. Kind of a bit of self-reporting, creating that kind of culture in an organization really can pay dividends.
Okay, so in terms of, because I imagine most companies, you know, it's a moving target, cybersecurity, but what are the one or two, you've mentioned the framework, you know, adopting a framework is, but is that your key piece of advice, and or what other things would you say that people, you know, should focus on in terms of ensuring that what they're doing is, is likely to be effective, as opposed to sort of just randomly doing stuff, as you say, whether it's responding to the latest buzzword. Someone said, oh, if you do this, just giving them a bit of a guidance in what's a fairly sort of stormy environment, shall we say.
I really do think pick a framework and align what you're doing with that, because otherwise it can just be a bit of I'm doing a number of useful things, but there's no cohesion, and I'm perhaps missing I may be implementing kind of the latest and greatest tooling, but missing the fact that, for example, I'm leaving the back door wide open because I've got let's say an open connection with a third-party supplier that's not being monitored and has got a well-known password or something like that. So I really do feel like adopting a framework that can guide you in the right direction is absolutely critical. And in addition to that, really get the basics done. Implement multi-factor authentication, implement a backup strategy, implement a vulnerability management strategy, and get some training for your users so that they really become a part of your defense, rather than kind of contributing to the problem through lack of education or just inadvertently.
And just finally, would that approach cover, because you mentioned earlier in the conversation, obviously, if you're an agile, fast-moving business and you don't want security to become a sort of block on what you might do, is it still possible to have that sort of framework and a certain amount of rules that will hopefully protect you at the same time as being, dynamic? Or will you always have to accept a slight trade-off that if you're going to empower, certain employees to do certain things, they might not always be able to, run it completely by the cybersecurity team before, the opportunity's gone through? Or is that, as I say, is it always possible to kind of get a security take on, any company activity, I suppose?
I think it is, and in those kinds of organizations, it may well be a helpful approach to say, hey, it'd be actually very helpful if we had a security champion in the software development organization, for example, and embed that from the get-go, and being able to hold those kind of risk-based conversations, not least in a dynamic and agile organization. It's not the office of no, but if you do X, Y, and Z, this is the risks that's associated with that. However, if you do it in this other way, then you achieve the same outcomes, but there's much less risk to the organization. And then in a way, you can present that to the risk owner. These are the trade-offs that you're making. And hopefully that dialogue can be ongoing. But I feel like if the office of CISO can lose this kind of label, whatever organization I'm in, of the office of no, and much more, we can do that. These are some of the risks that are associated with that. This is how we would suggest mitigating them. Then I think that can also make the wider organization, and this is kind of what the goal is, right? If a business unit can come to me and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this, what do you think? Then we've really achieved a great security culture within our organization.
Okay, it's been great to chat to you. Some brilliant insights. So Andrew, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.